At 7 p.m., my phone buzzed. A new message from Isabella. "You're not celebrating Christmas with us. Connor doesn't want to see you." That was it. No hello, no apology. Just an order. I read it twice, then once more. The Christmas lights blinked across the living room wall. Silence. I called. No answer. Called again. Still nothing. On the third ring, Connor picked up. "Mrs. Marlowe, we're busy. Isabella's resting." I kept my voice even. "So she texted me to stay home?" "She didn't mean it rudely." "She meant it clearly," I said. He exhaled. "It's our family Christmas. Please respect that." "Your family," I repeated quietly. "Noted." Then he hung up. I stood still for 10 seconds, phone in hand. Then I walked to my desk and opened the laptop. Password, Marlowe Estate Trust. Screen loaded. Balances appeared. Mortgage support, active. Car loan, active. Utilities, active. All under my name. All set to pay on December 25th. I hovered over the first line. Cancel. Confirm. Beep. Second. Cancel. Beep. Third. Beep. Each sound sharper than any Christmas bell. When the final tab appeared, their house payment, I stopped just long enough to breathe. Then I clicked delete chain. The screen flashed. Transaction canceled. "Merry Christmas, Connor," I said to no one. The kettle whistled. I poured water over a tea bag. Steady hands, steady breath. On the counter sat the copy of their loan agreement. I folded it in half and slid it into a drawer. Then I opened my planner. Savannah House, available. Flight options, open. I booked one, departure in 48 hours. Destination, Georgia. Price didn't matter. Peace did. I texted my lawyer, Paul Whitmore. Freeze all linked transfers to Hayes' account. Immediate effect. His reply arrived in 1 minute. Confirmed. Consider it done. My phone rang again. Isabella. Then again. And again. 5 calls. All ignored. I let the screen glow and fade. The tree lights reflected on the glass like tiny warning signals. They wanted distance. They would get it. I opened my email, sent one message to the caretaker of the Savannah estate. Prepare the guest wing. Owner arriving December 24th. Then I set my phone face down and poured another cup of tea. Not sweet, not bitter, plain, perfect. I checked the time, 7:42 p.m., 42 minutes since Isabella's text. Enough for a daughter to erase a mother, enough for a mother to erase her auto pay. Before turning off the lights, I wrote a note on the pad beside the phone. Do not disturb. Strategic silence in progress. Then I looked at the Christmas tree one last time and said quietly, "Merry Christmas to me." The click of the light switch was the cleanest sound of the night. Connor was the first to notice. He stood at the kitchen counter, coffee mug in hand, staring at the banking app on his phone. The color drained from his face. "Isabella?" he called, his voice low but tight. "Come here." She walked in, still in her robe, holding a plate of half-frosted cookies. "What?" He turned the screen toward her. "The trust account, it's frozen." She laughed, sharp, nervous. "That's impossible." "Then explain this." He shoved the phone closer. The app displayed one clear line. Account status, temporarily restricted. Access denied by trustee. Her smile faltered. She wouldn't. He stared at her. "You told me she doesn't control it anymore." "She doesn't, well, not completely. She what?" His tone cut through the air like glass. Isabella looked down. "She's still trustee on paper, but it's just legal formality." "Legal formality," he repeated. "That legal formality just froze $5 million. The silence stretched. Then Isabella grabbed her phone and dialed the bank. A woman's voice answered politely. "Yes, I need access restored to the Merritt Family Trust," Isabella snapped. "May I confirm your role, ma'am?" "I'm the beneficiary, Mrs. Connor Hayes." 1 moment. 30 seconds later, the banker returned. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. Only the trustee can unfreeze this account. That's my mother, Isabella said quickly. She didn't mean to. Trustee name is Helen Marlowe, the banker interrupted. Authorization hold placed by her directly last night. Isabella's voice cracked. Can she do that? Yes, ma'am. As trustee, she has full discretion. The line went silent. Then the banker's voice returned, calm but firm. Would you like to schedule an appointment to discuss alternative funding options? Isabella ended the call without answering. Connor set his mug down. What have you done? Nothing, she said too fast. She misunderstood. She's punishing me. He interrupted. She doesn't act without reason. Are you taking her side? I'm taking reality's side. And reality says you just cost us everything. She started pacing. Maybe I can talk to her. She ignored your calls. Then I'll drive there. To Vermont? She's probably already gone. Her voice cracked. Gone where? He looked at his phone again. Look at this. He showed her a social media post, a travel booking app notification. She booked a flight to Georgia. What? Savannah. Her other house. Isabella's breathing quickened. So she froze the account and ran off to celebrate herself? Connor's tone hardened. Or she finally stopped paying for people who disrespect her. Isabella grabbed her coat, shaking. I'll go to the bank. I'll fix it. He didn't move. You can't fix what she's teaching you. Don't lecture me now, she shouted. He exhaled, calm and final. You wanted control. Now you've got it. Without her money. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone again. The screen reflected her pale face. 5 missed calls, all unanswered. She's doing this on purpose, Isabella whispered. Connor said nothing. He simply looked in the silent tree in the corner, its lights blinking unevenly. Merry Christmas, he muttered. We just lost our sponsor. Across the state line, I sat on a plane, eyes closed, perfectly calm. Justice didn't always need noise. Sometimes it just needed a signature. The morning after Christmas, the air in Charleston felt sterile. Cold light filtered through the blinds, hitting the silver laptop like a stage lamp waiting for its actor. Helen sat down, coffee black, no sugar. Her eyes scanned the email header blinking on her screen. Subject, Transaction Alert, Hayes Family Investment Trust. She opened it. All linked accounts successfully frozen. Total amount, $10,000. She read it twice. No emotion, just confirmation. Helen dialed her lawyer. David, confirm the freeze, all $10 million. He cleared his throat. Confirmed. Every cent is under administrative hold. Do you want notifications sent to the dependents? No. You sure? Helen's tone was surgical. They'll discover it naturally. Learning through discomfort builds retention. David hesitated, then muttered, That's one way to educate a family. Helen replied, It's the only way when they confuse inheritance with entitlement. He exhaled softly. You're setting a precedent, Helen. I'm setting a boundary, she corrected. A pause. Then David asked, Do you want me to document the justification clause? Yes. File under moral misconduct, lack of fiduciary respect, emotional negligence. Use legal terminology if it makes it easier for them to read later. She heard him typing. You really mean to hold this until they contact you? No, Helen said calmly, until they understand the value of silence before arrogance. She ended the call. No goodbyes. On the desk lay her old notebook, a black leather ledger Henry once gave her when they founded their first company. Inside it, she wrote, Justice doesn't shout. It signs documents. Her handwriting was exact, engineer clean. The phone rang again. David, persistent. Helen, I have to warn you, the freeze might trigger alerts at the bank if anyone tries to withdraw. That's the point, she replied. The system will teach them before I have to. You're aware this will cause consequences? Helen interrupted. Yes, consequences are underrated. He laughed nervously. You sound like a boardroom CEO again. I didn't stop being one just because I retired. I just changed industries, from business to bloodline." He went silent. She closed the call for the second time. Her laptop screen dimmed to black. Reflection stared back. Calm, efficient, untouchable. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the slow click of her pen. Helen opened her secondary monitor. A spreadsheet of scheduled transactions, monthly transfers, tuition payments, expense allowances. She selected all rows and hit pause. Then she whispered, "Merry Christmas, Connor." Each frozen line on the screen was a record of dependency, each cell a quiet confession of how much they took for granted. She highlighted the total, $10,000, our zero liquidity, zero excuses. Her phone buzzed again. Notification from the security portal. Access attempt detected. Hayes family account, Charleston branch. Helen smirked. Right on schedule. She poured herself another cup of coffee. The bitter taste felt clean. A few minutes later, another alert appeared. Attempt failed. Unauthorized access. Helen leaned back in her chair and watched the reflection of the alert flicker on the glass table. "That," she said softly, "is the sound of education." On impulse, she opened a new email draft addressed to David. Subject, legal audit preparation. Body, prepare a review of all beneficiaries. Terminate passive accounts. Reassign oversight to me directly. End of year. No notice. She clicked send. Her phone buzzed again, this time from her assistant, Monica. "Morning, Mrs. Marlowe. Just saw the freeze order. Do you want me to notify your daughter?" "No. Let the silence notify her." "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes. Cancel the florist subscription. They only send flowers when guilt runs high." Monica chuckled awkwardly. "Of course." Helen hung up. She stood and crossed the room to the window. The neighborhood sparkled under post-Christmas quiet. Lights still twinkled, but the illusion of harmony had expired. She picked up her phone again and sent one short message. Not to her daughter, but to Pauline Reeves. Helen. Phase 1 complete. Freeze confirmed. Pauline. Finally, you always did prefer results over apologies. Helen. Apologies are cheap. Discipline compounds. She placed the phone down. In the mirror, Helen saw the faint reflection of herself. Precise haircut, black turtleneck, silver necklace Henry had given her decades ago. Still immaculate, still in control. Her calendar pinged. Flight to Zurich, 48 hours. She tapped confirm check-in. Then she returned to the notebook and added one more line under her morning entry. Silence is not weakness. It's data collection. The phone rang again, this time from Connor's number. She didn't answer. She waited until it stopped ringing, then typed into the margin, "Do not reward panic with attention." She closed the notebook, slipped it into her leather bag, and looked around her office one final time. Everything in its place, every file labeled, every consequence cued. The camera of the security system blinked twice, recording automatically. She smiled faintly and spoke to the empty room. Let them learn what efficiency feels like when it stops serving them. Then she turned off the light. The final sound before the door closed was the faint digital click of her phone screen locking, the same sound as the trust freeze. Helen didn't open her curtains that morning. The light wasn't necessary. She already knew what the day would bring. Panic, calls, questions. All the things silence punishes best. Her phone lit up. Pauline Reeves. Helen answered. "Morning, Pauline." Her friend's voice crackled through the speaker, dry as gin. "They froze you out again, huh?" Helen took a slow sip of coffee. "No, I froze them out this time." A pause, then laughter. "Finally, the iceberg moves." "I prefer the term correction." Pauline snorted. "Whatever you call it, I'm proud. I thought you'd tolerate that daughter and her banker husband until the grave." Helen's voice stayed level. "They assumed I would. Mistake number 1. "Remind me," Pauline said. "What did the message say again?" Helen opened her notes app and read it verbatim. "Mom, we're celebrating with Connor's parents this year. You stay home." Pauline whistled. Elegant. They dropped manners and punctuation in one text. I like efficiency, Helen said flatly. You didn't reply? I did something more educational. Which is? I froze the trust. Pauline's laugh burst sharp through the line. Oh, Helen, that's divine. How much are we talking? 10 million. You froze $10 million because of one text? No, Helen replied. I froze $10 million because it's the only language they still understand. Pauline quieted. You always were fluent in finance and vengeance. It's not vengeance, Helen corrected. It's math. Explain your math, Professor. Helen's tone never changed. Arrogance plus access equals abuse. Remove access, the equation stabilizes. Pauline grinned. You could teach at Harvard. I prefer results over applause. Pauline exhaled. So what's next? Do you wait for the panic or deliver the lesson personally? Helen checked her watch. They'll learn on their own. The first alert has already gone off at the bank. You're cruel. I'm precise. Pauline laughed again. Remind me never to cross you. You already know better. Helen walked across her living room, every step steady, controlled. On the mantel sat a framed photo. Isabella at 8 years old, smiling with missing teeth, holding a red ribbon she'd won in a school science fair. Beside her, the adult Isabella in Helen's memory, colder, dismissive, standing behind Connor at every decision. Pauline's voice softened slightly. You ever miss her? The version before the husband and the money? Helen answered immediately. Missing people is nostalgia. I deal in data. Pauline sighed. You've always used logic as armor. And it always fits. A small pause, the kind between friends who have said too much to need apology. Pauline changed the subject. You leaving the country? Helen sat back down. Yes. Zurich, then Prague. Charles always wanted to go there before he died. Consider it an overdue appointment. Pauline smiled through the line. So you freeze the family and fly to Europe. That's cold poetry, Helen. I don't write poetry, Helen said. I write closure. Pauline chuckled. I'll drink to that. Drink to timing instead. They'll see the photos before they realize what happened. Photos? I'll post one. Nothing obvious. Just a reminder that peace belongs to the disciplined. Pauline let out a low whistle. You're frightening when you sound this calm. Helen picked up her pen. Calm is the privilege of the prepared. She jotted a note into her journal. Never announce justice. Deliver it. Pauline continued. You know Margaret will lose her mind when she finds out you're in Europe while their accounts are frozen. That woman lives to be photographed near wealth. Then I'll give her something to photograph, Helen replied. Meaning? Helen closed her notebook. A picture of freedom. It drives the insecure insane. Pauline burst out laughing. God, you're ruthless. When do you leave? Tomorrow. First class, I assume. Of course. Dignity travels business class only when there's turbulence. Pauline laughed so hard she coughed. Helen, if there's a heaven, it just froze too. Helen's tone turned matter-of-fact. If there is one, it runs on accountability. The laughter faded. Pauline's voice softened again. You ever worry you'll regret cutting them off like this? Helen looked at her screensaver, the digital clock ticking forward exactly. No delay. Regret is emotional debt. I've cleared my balance. Pauline exhaled long, impressed. You sound untouchable. I am, at least until they learn, Pauline chuckled. You know, when people say silent night, they don't usually mean your kind of silence. They should, Helen said. It's effective. Another pause. Pauline finally murmured, All right, my favorite executioner, call me when you land. I want pictures from Prague. You'll get them, but only after the lesson is complete. Pauline grinned through her tone. You know what I love most about you, Helen? Enlighten me. You never raise your voice, but you always raise the temperature. Helen smirked. Then I must be global warming. Pauline laughed one last time. Safe travels, Ice Queen. Helen hung up, expression unchanged. The nickname didn't offend her. It was accurate. She turned back to her desk, pulled out a silver envelope from the safe, and slipped in a small note addressed to Isabella. Lesson 1. Silence has consequences. Lesson 2. So does disrespect. She sealed it, left it on the counter, and poured another glass of wine. "Merry Christmas," she said quietly, raising the glass to her own reflection. No toast, no smile, just confirmation. The phone buzzed again. Notification from the bank. Unauthorized withdrawal attempt blocked. Helen placed her glass down. "Right on time," she murmured. Then she closed the laptop, packed her passport, and whispered to the empty room, "Let the education begin." Charleston International Airport, 6:40 a.m. Helen moved through security like a woman who'd memorized the choreography of control. No wasted steps, no hesitation. Her passport and boarding pass were already aligned before the officer spoke. "Purpose of travel?" he asked. "Correction," she replied. He blinked. "Business or leisure?" "Neither. Observation." The officer smiled uncertainly, stamped her documents, and waved her through. At the gate, Helen chose a seat far from the crowd. Her suitcase stood upright beside her. Black, polished, silent. The kind of luggage that never begged to be carried. A voice broke the quiet. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up. A man in his 60s, gray hair cut military short, posture straight, eyes sharp. "No, but I'm not talkative." "Perfect," he replied. "I'm allergic to small talk." Helen turned back to her phone. The corner of her mouth almost moved. Almost. He sat down. "Robert Keene," he said after a pause. "Retired Navy. Traveling to Zurich?" "Yes." "Business?" "Accountability," she replied. He studied her profile for a moment, intrigued but cautious. "You don't sound like a tourist." "I'm not. I'm a correctional force in civilian form." He chuckled softly. "You talk like a report." "I write better than I talk." "Then we're opposites. I talk better than I write." Helen didn't smile, but her tone shifted slightly. "Do you always introduce yourself to strangers this early in the day?" "Only to the ones who look like they're running from something." "I'm not running. I'm recalibrating." He nodded slowly. "That's a new word for escape." "It's the accurate one." The boarding call echoed overhead. Flight 219 to Zurich. Final boarding in 20 minutes. Robert leaned back in his chair. "I used to fly through Charleston every December. My wife hated the season." Helen asked, "She gone?" 5 years. "Then you understand peace by subtraction." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a brutal way to put it." "It's the clean way," she replied. He chuckled. "You sound like someone who's just ended a war." Helen folded her hands. "Not ended, suspended. Peace requires proof." "Proof of what?" "That people learn." He tilted his head. "You're talking about family." "I'm talking about finance," she corrected. "But in my case, they're the same department." Robert laughed quietly. "I like that. I spent 30 years teaching young officers that discipline beats emotion. They never listened." "They will when the funding stops." He turned to her. "You remind me of Charles Marlowe. Served with him once, years ago. Smartest man I ever met. Always quiet before a storm." Helen froze for the first time that morning. "Charles Marlowe was my husband." Robert blinked. "No kidding. He saved my life on a Navy ship in '88. I owed him a drink I never got to buy." Helen looked away, steadying herself. He'd have said the favor was its own repayment. "That sounds like him," Robert said with a faint smile. "He used to say, 'Control what you can measure, accept what you can't.' I never forgot it." Helen's voice was lower now. "Neither did I." They sat in brief silence, both watching the runway lights blink through the glass. Robert spoke first. "He talked about you once, said you could balance a budget and a broken heart in the same sentence." "I preferred the budgets." He laughed quietly. "You haven't changed much." Helen turned to him. "You think you know me?" "No. But I recognize the type. Someone who leads even when they're not in uniform." Leadership is just efficient survival. True, but it's rare when it's elegant. The intercom voice called again. Final boarding for passengers on Flight 219. Robert stood and lifted his carry-on. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her suitcase. "No, I packed light on purpose." "Of course you did." He smiled, not offended, just impressed. "Zurich's cold this time of year." "So am I," she replied. He chuckled as they walked down the jetway. "You always this charming, Mrs. Marlowe?" "Only before sunrise." They reached the boarding door. The flight attendant scanned their passes. Robert stepped aside to let her enter first. "See you on the other side of efficiency." Helen stopped. "You sound like my husband." "Good. Maybe he taught me something." She studied him for a brief second. Maybe he did. Once seated on the plane, Helen glanced sideways. Robert was in the next row, reading quietly, not trying to continue the conversation. That she respected. When the engines roared to life, he leaned forward slightly and said just loud enough for her to hear, "Where are you heading, really?" Helen looked out the window. The tarmac lights reflected in her eyes like frozen currency. "Anywhere with better manners," he nodded. "You'll like Zurich then. They keep their clocks honest." Helen closed her eyes for a second. "Honesty is just punctuality with words." He smiled to himself. "You talk like Charles." "I was the one editing his speeches," she replied. He laughed under his breath. "Then you were the real captain." Helen didn't deny it. She adjusted her seatbelt and whispered more to herself than to him. "Still am." The plane began its slow pushback. Outside, Charleston shrank under the morning fog. Helen didn't look back. When the wheels lifted off, she checked her phone one last time before switching to airplane mode. A single notification blinked. Access attempt blocked. Hayes Family Investment Trust. Helen smiled faintly and locked the screen. Robert looked over. "Bad news?" "Predictable news." He nodded approvingly. "Then it's a good day." Helen turned her gaze to the window, the horizon clean and sharp ahead. Finally, it is. Prague, 2 days later. Snow fell without sound, covering the streets like a clean audit. The air smelled of cinnamon and commerce. Helen stood at the edge of the Christmas market, gloved hands in her pockets. Robert walked beside her, steady, precise, the kind of man who matched her rhythm without trying. "You walk like you're still inspecting something." "I am," she replied. "Discipline doesn't retire. Most people come here for nostalgia. I come for proof that peace exists outside pretense." He smiled. "You sound like a woman who's recently corrected her books. I prefer my ledgers balanced." They stopped near a stall selling glass ornaments. Robert picked one up, a small silver sphere, and held it toward the light. "Beautiful, fragile, expensive, reminds me of trust." Helen glanced at him. "Difference is, this one isn't inheritable," he nodded. "Fair point." A group of tourists passed by, taking photos. Helen's phone vibrated. She checked it. A notification from her bank. All freeze orders active. No changes. Robert noticed the faint smile. "Good news?" "Predictable news." "You always talk like an accountant at confession." "I believe in records, not redemption." Robert chuckled. "You know, Charles used to say the same thing. He hated apologies, loved receipts." "He taught me that apologies depreciate fast," Helen said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You miss him." Helen answered without hesitation. "I maintain him." Robert nodded once, understanding. They continued walking until they reached the square. A large Christmas tree glowed against the dusk, surrounded by vendors and music. Children laughed. Helen stopped, watching. Robert said quietly, "Strange, isn't it, how the world keeps celebrating while people correct their lives?" "It's efficient. The world runs better when nobody waits for approval." He smiled faintly. "That sounds like something Charles would have written on a card." He preferred ledgers. They stood together under the lights. Robert took a small camera from his pocket. "Mind if I take a picture? Charles would have liked that." Helen looked at him. "Make it factual, not sentimental." He raised the camera. "Understood. Neutral composition. 2 people. No pretense. Add distance. It keeps the honesty. Robert snapped the photo. He looked down at the screen, satisfied. Perfect. You look like someone who already won. I prefer verification to victory, she replied. Robert laughed softly. Same thing in the long run. Helen took out her phone, opened the image he'd just sent her. It showed her standing still among moving lights, snow swirling but not touching her coat. Robert was slightly blurred beside her. A witness, not a centerpiece. She typed a caption, "Merry Christmas from Prague." Then she posted it. Robert raised an eyebrow. You actually use social media? I use tools. Platforms are neutral until intention enters. Who's the audience? The people who forgot their source of income. He chuckled. You're cruel. I'm accurate. Moments later, her phone buzzed again, seen by Isabella. Helen didn't smile. She just said, now she knows. Robert looked curious. Knows what? That peace is transferable, but not inherited. He studied her. You speak like an economist of emotions. I manage both markets. They walked toward a cafe. Inside, the lights were soft, yellow, almost forgiving. Robert ordered coffee. Helen ordered tea. He asked, so what happens when you go back? I evaluate. And them? They recalibrate or remain broke. Robert laughed quietly. You don't negotiate, do you? Only with logic. The waiter brought their drinks. Helen stirred her tea once, then stopped. Do you know why I froze the trust? Robert shook his head. To punish arrogance? To price it, so they'd finally see its cost. He leaned forward. You really believe they'll understand? Eventually, she replied. People always learn once comfort leaves the room. Robert smiled. That's harsh. It's sustainable, Helen said. He nodded slowly, admiration under the calm. Charles would have liked seeing you like this, decisive, exact. Helen said, he trained me for structure, not sentiment. Robert raised his cup. To structure, then. Helen clinked hers lightly. And to silence, the most expensive teacher. Outside, the church bells rang. Tourists cheered. Helen looked out through the glass, watching snow blur the lights. Robert asked, Ever wonder if they'll call you? They already did. I didn't answer. Will you? When questions become statements. He laughed under his breath. You're terrifying, Helen. I'm disciplined. The difference is detail. They finished their drinks in silence. Helen opened her journal, wrote a single sentence. Robert leaned slightly to read it. Justice requires witnesses, not applause. He nodded. You should publish that. It's already published. They just haven't realized they're the readers. He grinned. Do you ever lose? Helen closed the journal. Only interest. Outside, another wave of notifications hit her phone. Shares, likes, comments. A ripple of public curiosity. Somewhere across the ocean, Isabella was scrolling, Margaret was gossiping, Connor was panicking. Robert noticed her phone vibrating and smirked. Going viral? Helen slipped it face down on the table. Just confirming audience engagement. He chuckled. You sound like a strategist. I am, always have been. This is just a new theater. He looked at her, respect plain in his eyes. You're colder than Prague in December. Helen sipped her tea. Temperature is relative. Discipline is constant. Outside, the bells stopped. The square quieted. Helen checked her watch, the silver hands moving with mechanical certainty. Time to return. Already? Precision doesn't linger. They stood, leaving exact change on the table. As they walked back into the cold, Robert asked, Any regrets about posting that photo? Helen adjusted her gloves. Regret is emotional tax. I've paid in full. They crossed the square. The lights behind them flickered like signatures on completed documents. Helen stopped once, glanced back at the market glowing behind glass. Proof delivered. Robert looked at her. And what do you call this stage of your plan? Helen answered, Public education. Then she walked on. Charleston, The same evening. The Marlowe house was quiet, but 5,000 miles away, a party was making noise on her behalf. Pauline's text arrived first. Pauline, incoming video, you'll love this. Helen tapped the link. A shaky phone clip loaded. Margaret Hayes at the head of her dining table, champagne glass raised. Margaret's voice carried over the clinking silverware. Poor Helen, always so dramatic. I told Isabella. Some women age into grace. She aged into spreadsheets. Laughter rippled around the table. Helen watched in silence. Isabella's face appeared on screen, frozen in discomfort. Connor leaned in, whispering something. She forced a smile. Margaret continued, louder now, drunk on her own spotlight. She probably thinks freezing money makes her powerful. Honestly, if control were an Olympic sport, she'd still come in second, to me. More laughter. Someone filmed closer. Pauline's message followed seconds later. Pauline, full house humiliation. How's that for gratitude? Helen set the phone on her desk, pressed play again, and listened until the clip ended. Then she poured a glass of wine. One sip, no comment. Her phone buzzed. Pauline again, calling this time. Helen answered. Good evening, witness. I assume you've seen it? Pauline asked. I've documented it. Pauline's tone sharpened. They're mocking you publicly, Helen. You could sue for defamation. Helen replied evenly. I prefer self-inflicted consequences. They're more efficient. Pauline sighed. You're terrifying when you sound calm. Calm is an advantage. It makes their noise measurable. Pauline exhaled. You sure you don't want to respond? A single post would silence them. Helen walked to her window. The night outside Prague glittered against the river. No, silence is already posting. Pauline paused. You're enjoying this. I'm analyzing it. Enjoyment is optional. Pauline laughed softly. What's your read? Margaret requires audience validation. Connor performs obedience. Isabella calculates shame but lacks courage for correction. Pauline chuckled. You just turned gossip into a diagnostic report. Everything is data if you stop feeling. Pauline whistled. You should give seminars. I just did. They paid in humiliation. Pauline's laughter broke again. You know, I should be horrified, but I'm applauding. Applause is premature. They haven't reached comprehension. What comes next? The silence phase. Meaning? They'll call. They always do after the echo fades. Pauline sighed. You really planned this down to human behavior curves. Predictability is the luxury of discipline. Pauline took a breath. All right, Professor. If I hear anything new, I'll send it. Do. Archive everything. Documentation matters more than emotion. Pauline's tone softened. Helen, you've changed. No, Helen corrected. I finally stopped subsidizing delusion. Pauline chuckled. That's colder than your wine. Helen ended the call with a polite, Good night. The apartment fell silent again. Helen reopened the clip once more, paused on Isabella's face. Regret flickered there, faint but visible. Helen whispered to the screen, Observation noted. Then she forwarded the video to her encrypted folder labeled Case Study, Hayes Family. Her phone rang again. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang a second time. This time she picked up. Mrs. Marlowe? A hesitant female voice asked. This is Helen. It's, Sophie, Margaret's niece. I just wanted to say that video wasn't fair. She was showing off. Helen's tone didn't waver. I appreciate your concern, Sophie. Did you post it? No. Someone else did. She asked for attention. People gave it. Then the data is accurate, Helen said. I guess. Anyway, sorry. My aunt can be predictable, Helen finished. Thank you for confirming. She hung up before Sophie could respond. Across the ocean, the gossip multiplied. Screenshots, whispers, online comments. Helen didn't block any of it. She tracked the traffic. Every share was proof. Every mockery, evidence of entitlement exposed. When her phone buzzed again, she expected more noise. Instead, it was an automated message. Bank alert. Multiple failed access attempts. Charleston branch. Helen set her wine down. Phase 2 initiated, she murmured. She drafted a note to David, her lawyer. Leave the freeze in place. Do not engage. Observation period active. She hit send. Later that night, Pauline messaged again. Another clip. Margaret just said you're probably alone in Europe pretending to be sophisticated. Helen replied, pretending implies doubt. I deal in confirmation. You're sure she won't apologize? Pauline asked. Not until the lights go out, Helen wrote back. Ego requires electricity. Pauline responded with 3 laughing emojis and, you're a menace. Helen typed one last line. No, I'm a mirror. Then she put the phone away. In Charleston, the laughter at Margaret's table died down as the Wi-Fi cut out. The music stuttered. Lights flickered. Margaret frowned, tapping her screen. Why is the bank app frozen again? She asked. Connor checked his phone. Mine too. Isabella went pale. It's happening again. Margaret forced a laugh. Maybe the system's overloaded. Maybe, Isabella whispered. Or maybe Mom's watching. In Prague, Helen turned off the news feed and looked out at the snow. The city was quiet now, obedient. She spoke to the window, voice calm as a ledger. Noise decreases when payment stops. Her phone buzzed once more. Pauline again. Any comment for the press? Helen replied with 3 words. Justice doesn't comment. She closed the message thread and wrote a final note in her journal. They mocked. The system answered. Balance restored. Then she underlined it once. No flourish, just verification. The glass of wine remained half full. She left it that way, a precise measurement of control. Charleston. The marble floor of the Hayes family bank reflected the fluorescent lights like an interrogation room. Isabella stood at the counter, card in hand, her voice low but trembling. There must be a mistake. The account's frozen. The banker, a young man in a blue tie, typed quietly. Ma'am, the system confirms a full administrative hold on the Hayes Family Investment Trust. Total funds, $10 million, all restricted. Margaret, standing behind her, snapped, Restricted by whom? By the primary holder, the banker replied. Mrs. Helen Marlowe. Connor rubbed the back of his neck. You're saying my mother-in-law shut us out? I'm saying, the banker corrected, you no longer have authorized access. Margaret scoffed. That's ridiculous. She can't just... She can, Isabella interrupted, voice breaking slightly. It's her trust. The banker kept his tone neutral. Would you like me to print confirmation of the freeze? Margaret's eyes narrowed. Print it, frame it, and tell her I'll see her in court. Connor whispered, With what money? She turned on him. Don't start. He raised both hands. Just stating the math. Isabella pressed a hand to her forehead. Is there any appeal process? Not without the trustee's consent, the banker said. Which means my mother, Isabella murmured. The banker hesitated. Yes, ma'am. Connor leaned closer to her. Call her. Just call. I already did, Isabella whispered. She didn't answer. Margaret hissed. Then call again. Isabella stared at the blank phone screen. It goes straight to voicemail. Margaret muttered, She's doing this for attention. Connor exhaled. If this is attention, it's expensive. The banker printed the slip and slid it forward. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. There's nothing we can do until the primary releases the hold. Isabella's voice dropped to a whisper. She won't. Not until she decides we've learned something. Margaret slammed her purse onto the counter. This is absurd. Who freezes their own daughter? The banker didn't answer. He'd seen worse. Divorces, fraud, inheritances torn apart. But this woman's composure made even him uncomfortable. Isabella turned away, gripping the frozen card in her hand like evidence of a crime. Connor followed quietly. What now? She said nothing. The elevator doors closed on their silence. Across the ocean, in a quiet Prague apartment, Helen received the alert. Access attempt detected. Charleston branch. She smiled. Right on time. Robert looked up from his coffee. Update? They tried to withdraw. He grinned. Educational moment. Helen opened her laptop, pulling up the bank's security dashboard. They triggered 3 failed authorizations in 6 minutes. Consistency, at least. Robert sipped his drink. Want me to guess who panicked first? Margaret, Helen said immediately. She reacts before thinking. Isabella analyzes before collapsing. Connor apologizes to everyone. Robert laughed quietly. Predictable pattern. Helen adjusted her glasses, scanning the data. Predictability is how you design consequences. Harsh, Robert said. Necessary, she corrected. Without pressure, lessons dissolve. He looked at her for a moment, almost studying her. You ever wonder if you go too far? Helen closed the laptop. Only when I stop too soon. Robert nodded slowly. You're something else, Helen. I'm structured, he chuckled. You should have been an admiral. I was married to one in disguise. He smiled. Charles would have enjoyed this. Charles designed this, she replied. Meanwhile, in Charleston, Isabella sat in the car outside the bank, staring at the frozen account slip. Connor tried to lighten the mood. Maybe it's temporary. Nothing she does is temporary, Isabella said flatly. Margaret groaned. She's punishing you. She's always been jealous of you, darling. Isabella turned sharply. No, Mother, she's disappointed. Margaret frowned. Same difference. No, Isabella said. One comes from hate, the other comes from knowledge. Connor murmured. Sounds like your mom. Isabella glared at him. This isn't funny. I'm not laughing, just trying to process being broke. Margaret crossed her arms. We're not broke. We have our own savings. Connor shook his head. You mean her savings? Everything's in the trust. The house, the cars, the accounts, all tied to her generosity. Margaret's voice dropped. Then we need a lawyer. And pay them with what? Connor asked. Isabella exhaled sharply. Enough. I'll handle this. Margaret's tone softened. She's your mother. She won't stay angry forever. Isabella stared out the window. She's not angry. She's executing policy. Back in Prague, Helen checked the time difference and opened her messages. Pauline. They're melting down at the bank. Margaret's voice could shatter glass. Helen. Good. Fractures create clarity. Pauline. Isabella looked pale. Maybe guilt's finally working. Helen. It's not guilt. It's comprehension. Stage 2. Pauline. You're documenting this like a research paper. Helen. Behavioral economics. Case study. Entitlement correction. Pauline replied with a laughing emoji and, You're enjoying this. Helen typed back, I'm observing outcomes. Enjoyment is irrelevant. She placed the phone down beside her tea. They'll call within the hour, she said to Robert. You'll answer? He asked. I'll let the silence answer first. He nodded, amused. You're terrifyingly consistent. I prefer predictable. Terror is inefficient. Robert leaned back in his chair. You really think they'll learn? They'll adjust. Learning implies humility. That takes longer. He smiled. And if they don't? Then the freeze becomes permanent. Robert raised his cup in a small salute. To permanent education. Helen clinked hers lightly. To measurable progress. In Charleston, the calls began. Isabella's first attempt went to voicemail. Mom, we need to talk. Please, just call me. The second one was shorter. Mom, I know you're getting these. The third was only silence and a sigh before hanging up. Margaret grabbed the phone. Give it here. She dialed Helen's number and waited. Voicemail again. Margaret snapped. She's doing this to humiliate us, Isabella said quietly. No, to remind us. Connor muttered, Of what? That everything we have was hers to begin with. The car went silent. Margaret looked away first. In Prague, Helen watched the incoming calls appear, one after another. She didn't reject them. She let them ring, each tone a reminder that patience was power. When the last call ended, she wrote a line in her journal. Lesson acknowledged, not yet learned. She placed the pen down, her expression neutral. Robert looked over. How's the family seminar? Enrollment complete. No tuition yet. He laughed softly. You're cruel. I'm consistent, she replied. Outside, church bells rang over the river. Helen looked out at the lights and said quietly, "Every correction begins with noise. Then comes silence." The phone buzzed again. Pauline this time. "They're calling everyone, even the lawyer." Helen replied, "Let them call. I'm not answering until they stop speaking like victims." Robert glanced at her. "And when that happens?" Helen's voice was final. "Then I'll consider unfreezing what's left of their dignity." She closed the journal, the silver watch on her wrist ticking once, precise as judgment. Zurich, early morning. The air was clean enough to feel engineered. Helen sat in the hotel lounge with her coffee and ledger, writing her daily notation. Observation: silence teaches faster than punishment. Across from her, Robert arrived with a small envelope in his hand. It was silver-edged, old-fashioned, creased by time. He placed it on the table. "I think this belongs to you." Helen looked up. "What is it?" He slid it closer. "A letter from Charles. He gave it to me years ago. Said I'd know when to deliver it." Helen stared at it. "Why now?" "Because yesterday, when you froze $10 million without raising your voice," Robert said, "I knew you'd reach the point he predicted." Helen didn't move. "You've been carrying this all these years?" "Every deployment. Never opened it. Orders are orders." She picked up the envelope, studied the handwriting, Charles's penmanship, angular and neat, like his discipline. Robert said quietly, "He told me you'd eventually win the wars no one saw coming." "I don't fight wars. I correct them." "Semantics," Robert replied. Helen slipped her finger under the flap and unfolded the letter with surgeon-like precision. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and salt. Robert stayed silent. Helen read, "If she ever finds kindness, let her. If she ever stops defending and starts defining, let her live. Helen, I know how you think. You'll measure loyalty like a balance sheet and count respect like dividends. That's fine. But when they break your system, and they will, don't rebuild it for them. Build it for yourself. Don't look for proof in apologies. Proof lives in what they do when you leave the room. You're the only person I've ever met who could turn pain into precision. Just remember, the goal isn't silence, it's peace. One's a tactic, the other's an outcome. If you ever need a witness to remind you that you were right, show them this letter. It means you've reached the point I always knew you would. Charles." Helen folded the letter carefully and set it down beside her cup. Robert spoke softly. "He always said you'd outthink every man he served with." Helen didn't smile. "He exaggerated." "No," Robert said. "He analyzed." She looked out the window at the Swiss skyline. "He knew I'd get here." "He did," Robert replied. "He said your justice would look like discipline, not drama." Helen traced one finger along the edge of the letter. "He understood I don't need applause, just confirmation." Robert nodded. "That's why he trusted me to deliver this." She looked at him. "You kept his word." "I owed him that, and I owed you proof." Helen leaned back, composed. "You've delivered both." They sat in silence for a moment. Robert broke it. "You ever wonder if Charles left the money in your hands for this reason?" "I don't wonder. He left it because he trusted my arithmetic." Robert laughed softly. "Arithmetic of morality." Helen corrected. "Of boundaries." He nodded, amused. "You're consistent." "Consistency is the closest thing to faith I have left." Robert looked at the letter again. "It's strange, isn't it? A dead man still mediating from beyond the grave." Helen said, "Charles never died in principle, only in presence." Robert smiled faintly. "That's the most emotional thing you've said since we met." "I was quoting policy," she replied. He laughed quietly. "You always win the semantics game." "I don't play games. I set rules." Robert nodded approvingly. "That's what makes you unstoppable." Helen took the letter again and placed it inside her ledger. He wrote this as a safeguard. He knew emotion was inefficient. He gave me structure instead. Looks like it worked, Robert said. Helen looked down at her watch, Charles's old one, still ticking perfectly. He never missed a deadline. Robert's tone softened. Neither do you. Helen replied, Deadlines are moral. They remind people time isn't negotiable. He leaned forward. So what's next? Return, Helen said. To Charleston? Yes, to verify results. Robert smiled. You sound like a scientist running experiments on humanity. Helen didn't deny it. Every family is a lab. Mine just has better documentation. Robert chuckled. You realize most people would call that cruel. Then they've never managed an inheritance. He raised his cup. To Charles, the man who built the foundation. Helen lifted hers. And to structure, the system that outlives him. They clinked glasses once, quietly. Robert watched her for a moment. Do you ever feel alone doing this? Helen said, Alone is peaceful when the alternative is chaos. He nodded. You really mean that? I don't say what I don't mean, she replied. Robert smiled faintly. Charles used to say that too. Then he was right twice, Helen said. They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded more like closure than humor. Helen picked up the letter one more time, slid it into a folder marked Legacy Documentation, and closed it with care. Robert said, You could frame it, you know. No, framing makes it sentimental. Keeping it makes it functional. He looked impressed. You even grieve efficiently. I don't grieve, Helen said. I update. Robert sat back, watching her seal the envelope and write one small note on the flap in her firm handwriting. Proof received. She placed it back in her bag and checked her phone. No new messages, no missed calls. Robert said, Looks like the chaos paused. Temporarily, she replied. They're recalculating. He smirked. And you? I'm preparing Act 3. He raised a brow. The confrontation? The audit. Confrontations waste time. Audits fix systems. Robert laughed under his breath. You make revenge sound like corporate management. Helen met his eyes, because that's all it is. Performance evaluation. He grinned. Charles would have loved that line. He wrote it first. They both sat in silence again. After a while, Helen opened her notebook and added one last line beneath her earlier entry. Peace is proof achieved through correction. Then she closed it. Robert glanced at the folder, now holding the letter. You done? Helen said, No, I'm confirmed. Charleston, late afternoon. The Marlowe house looked smaller than Helen remembered, as if arrogance had been drained from its walls. She parked, stepped out, and walked to the door without hesitation. Inside, voices were already raised. Isabella's first. She can't just walk in here after what she did. Helen opened the door. Then close it, if you can afford the utilities. The room froze. Connor stood near the dining table, Margaret behind him, wine in hand. Isabella turned, face pale. Mother. Daughter. Margaret set down her glass with a clink. How bold of you to appear uninvited. Helen removed her gloves. Boldness fills the silence when entitlement collapses. Connor muttered, This isn't necessary. Helen looked at him. Neither were the withdrawals you attempted. He flinched. Margaret folded her arms. We were only accessing what's ours. Helen's tone was precise. Correction. What was granted? Access can expire. Isabella stepped forward. You humiliated us. The entire bank knows. Helen. The bank always knew. They just confirmed my audit. Isabella's voice shook. You ruined everything. Helen answered calmly. No, I revealed it. Connor's face reddened. You embarrassed us publicly. You did that, Helen said, when you built your life on my money. Silence hit the room like a gavel. Margaret tried to recover. You think this display makes you superior? No, Helen replied. It makes me solvent. Robert stood quietly by the door, invited witness, silent verifier. Margaret noticed him. Who's he? Your lawyer? Your bodyguard? Neither, Helen said. He's proof that respect doesn't retire. Robert nodded once, nothing more. Isabella looked at him, then back at her mother. Why did you come? To collect clarity, Helen said, and to measure comprehension. Isabella swallowed. You could have just talked to us. Helen's eyes stayed fixed. You don't talk to people who trade apology for access. Margaret scoffed. Such drama. Documentation, Helen corrected. Everything I do leaves a record. Connor exhaled. So, this is revenge? Helen looked directly at him. Revenge wastes time. This is risk management. Robert smiled faintly. Isabella stepped closer. You could unfreeze it now. You've made your point. Helen, have I? Recite it then. Isabella blinked. What? Recite the point, Helen repeated, so I know it was received. Isabella hesitated. That actions have consequences. Partial credit, Helen said. Continue. That money isn't guaranteed? Helen shook her head slightly. No, that respect is currency. You defaulted. Isabella's shoulders sagged. Mother, please. Helen's tone stayed steady. You sent me a message. You stay home. I complied. I stayed home, then redefined which house qualified. Connor muttered, You can't keep punishing her forever. Forever is irrelevant, Helen said. Duration depends on discipline. Margaret snapped, You're heartless. Accurate, Helen said. Hearts confuse data. Robert coughed lightly to hide a laugh. Helen continued, I gave each of you opportunities. Access, trust, equity. You turned them into spectacle. Margaret, you hosted gossip. Connor, you enabled dependence. Isabella, you mistook inheritance for identity. I simply adjusted the formula. Margaret glared. You think you're a god? No, Helen said. Just an accountant with better timing. Isabella's voice cracked. What do you want from us? Proof of comprehension, Helen said. Not tears, not excuses. Connor whispered, And if we give it? Then I'll consider restoration. Robert leaned forward slightly. She means it. Isabella looked between them. You brought him to intimidate us? Helen shook her head. No. To witness. Accountability requires audience. Margaret pointed a shaking finger. You're cruel. Helen stepped closer. Cruel would have been silence without explanation. This is structured learning. Isabella's eyes filled, but she held steady. What do you need to hear? The truth, Helen said. Start with yourself. I was wrong, Isabella said softly. Helen's gaze hardened. Specificity adds value. I let them influence me. I let pride replace gratitude. Helen nodded once. Better. Connor looked at his wife. Izzy. She held up her hand. Don't. Then to her mother. I get it now. Helen said, Understanding isn't compliance. It's verification. Robert stepped forward. Helen. She turned slightly. He said, You've achieved it. They know. Knowing and maintaining are different, Helen replied. Audits require follow-up. Margaret exhaled loudly. You're impossible. Helen faced her. No, Margaret. I'm complete. She pulled an envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. Inside are documents transferring the trust to conditional oversight. It will reopen when honesty exceeds arrogance. Connor frowned. What does that mean? Helen said, You'll find out when you stop asking for definitions. Isabella reached for the envelope. May I? Helen nodded. Access requires responsibility. You just applied. Margaret muttered, You talk like a courtroom. Justice is a language. I'm fluent. She turned toward the door. Robert followed. Isabella called after her. Will you stay for dinner? Helen paused. Serve truth. I might. Then she left the room, her heels clicking like a metronome of consequence. Outside, Robert fell into step beside her. That was efficient. It was overdue, Helen said. They'll change, he offered. Possibly. Pressure produces results. Robert smiled. You really did it. Public humiliation without raising your voice. Helen glanced at him. Volume is for amateurs. He chuckled. What will you do now? Observe. Education needs evaluation. Robert nodded. So this was the confrontation? This was the audit, Helen corrected. He laughed under his breath. Then the numbers checked out. Helen looked back once at the house, still lit, but quiet now. Balance restored, she said softly. Then she walked toward the waiting car. The silver watch on her wrist caught the fading light. Precise, silent, unstoppable. Charleston. 2 days later, the air carried that post-holiday quiet when people start counting what's left. Helen arrived exactly at noon. The door was unlocked, predictably careless. Isabella, Connor, and Margaret were already at the dining table. The food looked decorative. No one had eaten. Helen placed a single folder on the table and sat down. Why are you here? Margaret asked. Helen answered, because balance requires closing entries. Isabella swallowed hard. If this is another lecture, it's an audit. Final review before possible reinstatement. Connor leaned back. Reinstatement of what? Access, Helen replied. To money, property, and dignity, in that order. Silence. Isabella's voice was small. What do we have to do? Helen looked at her, steady. Tell the truth, not as apology, as data. Margaret rolled her eyes. You act like this family is a corporation. Helen said, corporations last longer. Connor exhaled. All right, fine. You want truth? We panicked. We depended on your money. We shouldn't have. Helen nodded once. Acknowledged. Margaret snapped, don't grade us like students. I'm grading comprehension. Remorse without clarity is performance. Isabella's tone cracked. Mother, we get it. You're in control. You've made your point. No, I made the numbers align. The point is still pending. She opened the folder. Inside were printed statements, notarized amendments, and one page titled Conditional Unfreeze Agreement. Robert stood quietly near the doorway, witness again. Helen began reading, each word like a verdict. Clause 1. The trust remains frozen until the beneficiaries demonstrate sustained honesty. Clause 2. Overspending equals relapse. Clause 3. Disrespect voids all reinstatement privileges. Connor blinked. You wrote this like a legal contract. It is. Morality performs better with documentation. Isabella whispered, What does demonstrate honesty even mean? Helen looked directly at her. Start by not asking what integrity costs. Margaret scoffed. You can't monitor every move we make. Helen's voice didn't rise. I already did. You just didn't notice. Connor rubbed his temple. You tracked us? I observed spending patterns. The data showed dependency, not gratitude. Isabella tried to meet her eyes. And if we change? Helen replied. Then access returns, proportionally. Margaret muttered. How generous. Helen turned to her. Generosity ends where arrogance begins. Robert coughed lightly to cut the tension. Maybe what she's saying is accountability first, reward later. Helen nodded once. Precisely. He listens faster than you do. Isabella whispered, Mom, I know I hurt you. Helen corrected her. You miscalculated me. There's a difference. Then let me fix it. Fixing requires proof. Words depreciate. Behavior appreciates. Isabella took a breath. Then tell me how. Helen gestured toward the papers. Sign. Accept conditional oversight. Manage your household without withdrawals for 90 days. Live within actual means. Connor frowned. You're testing us. Verification, Helen said. Testing implies doubt. I'm confirming variables. Margaret's tone was icy. You're enjoying this power trip. Helen looked at her calmly. Power is an illusion. Control is mathematics. Robert almost smiled. Isabella reached for the pen but hesitated. What happens if we fail? The freeze becomes permanent. The estate converts to charitable trust under my name. Margaret gasped. You'd give it away? Helen's expression didn't change. Unused assets serve better elsewhere. Isabella's voice trembled. That's not what Dad wanted. Helen tapped the silver watch on her wrist. Your father wanted accountability. The watch still runs because he maintained it. The family can do the same. Connor whispered, And if we sign? Helen replied, Then you begin repayment, in decency. Robert stepped forward, handing Isabella the pen. Start there. Isabella took it slowly, eyes wet but steady. You're not forgiving us, are you? Helen said. Forgiveness inflates ego. Correction stabilizes it. Isabella signed. Connor followed without a word. Margaret stayed still. I won't sign something that treats me like an employee. Helen met her gaze. Employment requires value. Right now, you're overhead. The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Margaret grabbed the pen and signed, hard enough to tear the paper. There, happy? Helen replied, No, verified. Robert gathered the documents and sealed them in a new envelope. Isabella looked at her mother. Will you stay for dinner? Helen answered, When the food stops performing. Meaning? When gratitude becomes flavor again. Connor almost smiled. You really have a line for everything. Helen turned to him. Precision leaves no room for improvisation. He nodded slowly. You're something else, Mrs. Marlowe. I'm consistent, she said. Robert placed the sealed envelope in his briefcase. What happens next? Helen replied. Monitoring period, 90 days, monthly review, honesty metrics. Margaret groaned. Metrics? We're not numbers. You became statistics when you treated respect as optional. Robert gave a low whistle. You should run the treasury. I already do. It just happens to share my last name. She stood. The others remained seated. Isabella rose quietly. Mom, thank you for giving us a chance. Helen paused at the door. Chance is temporary. Discipline is permanent. She looked back once at the table. 3 signatures, 1 folded napkin, 3 people recalculating their lives. To Robert, she said, Close the file. He nodded. Case audited, pending improvement. Helen picked up her gloves. Good. Before leaving, she added one last statement. Cold, simple, final. Kindness is the only currency left. Spend it wisely. Then she walked out, the sound of her heels sharp against the tile, an even tempo, like a clock confirming order restored. 1 year later. Charleston was quiet again. Christmas lights glowed on porches, softer this time, less noise, more order. Helen parked outside the same house. It no longer felt like a battlefield, only an archive of lessons. Robert was beside her. Ready for the final audit? Helen adjusted her gloves. I prefer the term evaluation. Audits imply suspicion. He smiled. Ever the mathematician. Helen walked up the path. Inside, laughter, controlled, careful, floated from the dining room. When she entered, everyone stood. Isabella first. Mom, Helen nodded once. Status report. Connor cleared his throat. Mortgage paid, no new debt, household expenses within limit. Margaret added quietly, No parties. Helen's gaze scanned the room. No champagne bottles, no extravagant dishes, only roasted chicken, vegetables, and a single pie. Progress confirmed. Isabella gestured to a seat. Please sit. Helen sat, but did not remove her coat. Observation first, participation later. Connor tried to smile. We've been waiting for you, Helen replied. Waiting is efficient only when productive. Robert leaned near her. You never change. Helen, stability is underrated. Isabella placed a small envelope beside Helen's plate. We wanted to show accountability. It's a statement from the last year, every transaction, every repayment. Helen opened it, pages of printed spreadsheets organized by category. She read the first lines, lips barely moving. Structured, transparent. Finally. Isabella's tone softened. We learned, the hard way. Helen looked up. Learning that lasts is never easy. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. I suppose you came to unfreeze it now. Helen replied, Not yet. First, verification of comprehension. Connor frowned. Meaning? Helen looked at each of them. What have you gained that doesn't depreciate? Isabella answered quietly, Trust. Helen waited. Margaret sighed. Discipline. Helen turned to Connor. He said, Peace. The kind that doesn't need money to buy. Helen nodded once. Acceptable metrics. Robert smiled faintly. So, what's the verdict? Helen reached into her bag and removed a single envelope, smaller, sealed, marked with her signature. She placed it on the table. Inside are the reinstatement documents. Effective today, the trust reopens. Isabella exhaled. You mean? Yes, full access, under continued observation. Margaret blinked. Observation? Helen's voice remained even. Freedom without oversight is relapse. Connor smiled weakly. We expected that. Helen turned slightly. Good. Expectation indicates memory. Isabella stepped forward. Thank you. Helen replied, Gratitude confirmed, when repeated through action. Robert chuckled. You make kindness sound like accounting. Helen looked at him. It balances better that way. He handed her a small box. Then here's a dividend. She opened it. Inside, a silver chain, simple and strong. He nodded toward her wrist. For the watch, you've earned lighter weight. Helen attached it, the metal cool against her skin. Functional gift. Approved. Isabella smiled faintly. You never say anything like beautiful or lovely, do you? Helen, adjectives distract from accuracy. Margaret laughed softly for the first time. She really hasn't changed. Helen turned to her. Change isn't the goal. Calibration is. The tension in the room melted, not sentimental, just precise alignment. Helen stood, looking around the table. 1 year ago, this room hosted chaos. Today, it hosts order. That qualifies as improvement. Isabella nodded. We worked for it. Then maintain it. Maintenance is the only real proof. Robert raised a glass of water. To maintenance, then. Helen lifted hers. To earned balance. They drank. No toast, no loud cheer, just quiet acknowledgement. Connor said, We're glad you came back. Helen looked at him. Returning is easy. Rebuilding isn't. Keep rebuilding. He nodded. We will. Isabella hesitated, then stepped closer, arms half raised. May I? Helen paused, then nodded once. Isabella hugged her. Brief, firm, no tears. Helen didn't move, but didn't resist. When Isabella let go, Helen said, Accepted. Robert whispered, Progress noted. Helen turned to him. File closed. Margaret gestured to the pie. Would you like some dessert? Helen glanced at it. Is it homemade? Yes. Then yes. Authentic effort deserves consumption. Everyone laughed quietly. The sound was real this time. Calm, not loud. As they ate, Helen removed a small journal from her bag. She wrote one line, clean and final. I celebrated Christmas by celebrating order. Robert leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. Order? She looked up. It lasts longer than happiness. He smiled, and maybe defines it. Helen didn't answer. She closed the journal, set down her pen, and watched the candlelight reflect on the silver watch. The chain gleamed, measured, balanced, earned. Isabella's voice broke the quiet. Will we see you next year? Helen said, If consistency continues. Robert chuckled. You even speak like a contract. Helen, contracts keep people honest. The clock chimed 7. Helen stood. Isabella walked her to the door. "Mom, thank you for not giving up on us." Helen replied, "Correction, I didn't give up on structure." Outside, the air was crisp, controlled. Helen and Robert walked toward the car in silence until he said, "Does it feel over?" Helen looked at him. "Justice doesn't end. It maintains itself." He nodded. "Still, it's peace, isn't it?" Helen opened the car door. "Peace by verification." He laughed softly. "Of course." As the car pulled away, the house behind them glowed with steady light, not bright, not dim, just balanced. Helen glanced once more at the watch on her wrist. The hands moved in perfect rhythm. Time didn't forgive. It simply confirmed. When I closed that file, I realized justice doesn't always need applause. It just needs discipline. For some, Christmas means gifts or laughter. For me, it meant clarity, a year measured, corrected, and finally balanced. No shouting, no revenge, only order restored. If this story made you stop for a moment, to think, to breathe, to recognize your own worth, then that's enough. Because sometimes silence teaches louder than words ever could. I learned that giving isn't weakness, it's control, and that freezing what was wrong can unfreeze what still deserves to grow. So wherever you're watching from, your kitchen, your porch, your quiet evening, I hope you remember one thing. You're allowed to protect your peace. You're allowed to walk away from disrespect. And you never have to explain logic to those who refuse to understand it. This story was not about revenge. It was about correction and the dignity of doing it quietly. If you found a piece of yourself in this story, subscribe to Grandma Life Stories. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. We always read them. And if you want to send a little kindness today, just tap like. It helps more people hear stories of calm strength, the kind that changes families without a single raised voice. Thank you for spending your time here. I'll see you in the next story, where silence will speak again.